Let's start from the school. We all have been to school, and we all most likely have learned at school that the boundary between Europe and Asia runs from the Kara Sea all along the Ural Mountains, along Ural River to the Caspian Sea, and then, depending a bit on definitions, for the Caucasus, to the Black Sea, and then to the Mediterranean. This is something that school children all over the world, as far as now in every single country, learn nowadays in geography. And because in this lecture we talk about geopolitics, I can already tell you that this division has little to do with practical understandings of Asia. It is something that has found its way globally to school books. But in practical politics, economics, sociology, culture, whatever, almost nobody uses it. It is a kind of cultural anomaly that children are being taught sort of mistaken information. But it's common global information all over the world. As a matter of fact, I have climbed to the top of the Ural Mountains and seen the boundary there, the boundary between Europe and Asia. But we'll see that a bit later. I'll show you a couple of practical ways of defining Europe. This here is based on private discussions with a Singaporean professional and educated person a few years ago. And I asked her, where is Asia? Where does she think Asia is? She said, it is ASEAN. And perhaps some places like Japan or China or India can be counted to Asia. But she actually does not. She don't think that they are Asians. For her, ASEAN is enough for Asia. So this is quite different from school book geography. There is only one single person, but when we look at the understanding of names and concepts, academic terms, we also have to count the opinions of single persons. Her opinion is not global. It is a personal opinion, but important as such. Then, if you are living within the European Union, the European Union is pushing quite strongly the idea of common European identity, common European market, common European foreign policy. The common European comes very strongly up there. And also it is never stated publicly in official European Union rhetoric, but you can see it in newspapers where private persons write their opinions, and in blogs, internet discussions. There's a vague idea that Asia starts from the eastern boundary of the European Union. Not that it comes too often up, but this kind of opinions do exist also. Also here we don't talk about the Urals. But again, we are talking about practical uses of language. perhaps it's not strictly Asia, but there is something that is not necessarily completely, totally European. Because we deal with a dichotomy, Europe, Asia, always supposed to be together. What is not completely European has some characteristics of Asia. Again, another practical way of understanding Asia. This comes forward in East Asian public discussions, not as a definition, but when you enumerate which countries belong to Asia, with which countries do you have cooperation, which countries take part in international conferences, you often turn up with this list: Japan, South Korea, China, Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, India, sometimes Pakistan, sometimes not. Smaller countries like Nepal, Bhutan, Mongolia, maybe they or maybe not, but they don't count so much. So this may be said to be a fairly strong, widely spread contemporary East Asian understanding of Asia. It started somewhere in the 1980s to spread, and it is still going on. And will probably do that for quite a long time still. Then let's go to theory, because theory is always very interesting. And let's start from Confucius. I'm very happy because we have Chinese people here, because my pronunciation of Chinese is extremely bad. Could you please read these? Yes. Thank you. 谢谢. This is one of the oldest theoretical ideas about the importance of names. As a translation, if names are not correct, speech has no effect. And if speech has no effect, matters do not succeed. This is an argument that names are the most important elements in argumentation. So when we are talking about this Asia as a name, it has a different meaning for Europeans. It has a different meaning for East Asians. And you have to know where you are, with what kind of people you are speaking, to be able to communicate effectively with them. Because has anyone of you ever been to Europe? Okay, it's still in the future for you. If you go there and start talking about Asia, the images that come to European minds may be something like Turkey and Iraq and so on. And here, if you talk about Asia, Turkey and Iraq hardly count. For instance, I have been discussing with Japanese people about soccer, football, where they have been complaining that they don't want necessarily to play soccer with Saudi Arabians or Iraq's people or so on, because they don't feel to belong to the same group. You have to know what kind of names you are using. And this lecture series is meant to help you to navigate internationally in these kind of situations. Something that Confucius has said 2,500 years ago is still being discussed also in European philosophy. Ludwig Wittgenstein was a very famous Austrian philosopher who also did part of his working life in Britain. Practically one of the most famous 20th century European philosophers. Very influential. And his most influential book is this, Philosophische Untersuchungen, which he wrote after the Second World War, to 1945 to 1949. He actually never published the book himself. I don't actually know why he withdrew it from the publisher, but then it was later published after his death. Philosophische Untersuchungen, Philosophical Investigations is the name of the book. And in this book, he is talking about something called language games, Sprachspiel in German. It can be translated as a language game, also as a language play. Spiel can be both game and a play. The idea in all this is that if you start some kind of research and you, because you are here, you probably have to do some kind of master level research or doctoral level research, or then you are already professional researchers. It is wise for you not to go too early into definitions. In normal university education, students are taught definitions of various kinds of concepts. Family, state, economy, interaction, there are lots of concepts. And sometimes these concepts may hide more than they really reveal about the society. The basic argument of Wittgenstein was that the meaning of words, of a word, is in its use, not in the definitions that exist in the books of authorities. Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, Emil whatever. But you have to go to see how people are actually using the concepts. All people are creative beings. We play with words. We bring the language forward by looking at the world from our own perspectives and change the meanings, sometimes greatly, sometimes only smallly, of concepts. Game, spiel, doesn't refer only to a situation where people use language in a light-hearted way, but it refers to a situation where there are rules on how people use the words. In different settings, different parts of the world, different professions, people have rules for the way they speak. That's why Kansai Ben and Kanto Ben are different, because they are different rules. And the farther you go to more distant places geographically, in terms of professions, the more different rules you find. And the task of a researcher is to go and see what kind of rules are being used within this, or for this word, concept, or term. And that is also what we are doing in this lecture series. We are looking at the rules of the name Asia, how it has been used over about 2 or 3 millennia. So we are looking for rules. Now let's go to see one practical place. I said I have climbed to the top of Ural Mountains. It was not very difficult. I took a taxi from nearby town, and then we drove to the top. Ural Mountains are not very high. You can see them here. Anybody who has learned at school geography, would think that there is some kind of 5 kilometer tall, big mountains, which can act as a real boundary between 2 continents. Asia, which is big, and Europe, which is smaller but important nevertheless. This is not the case. It is mostly slow, hilly country with lakes and valleys and so on. There are places where you can have actual mountains, half a kilometer high, at the highest about 1 kilometer. But it's thousands of kilometers long, and most of it is not actually mountains. How can this kind of place be a boundary between Europe and Asia? It is because there used to be a specific language game in Russia about 300 years ago. But at the top of the mountain, you can find a monument written in Russian, where it says Asia and Europa, meaning Asia and Europe. It is there. I have had the pleasure of standing here with 1 feet in Asia and 1 foot in Europe. It felt so nice. But I was also quite surprised, because I didn't find anything else. This is what Asia looks like from the boundary. There is a big highway, lots of cars going back and forth. This is what Asia looks like. In the same place, this is what Europe looks like. It's not difficult to go there. You fly or take the boat to Vladivostok or somewhere in China. But if you're Japanese, going to Vladivostok might be good, because it is a road that many generations of Japanese have taken to Europe. And from there you step to the train, Trans-Siberian train, nice train, sleeping cars. And then you sit there for about 7 days, 7 nights, and you step out in a city called Yekaterinburg. It is near these Ural mountains, and from there you can take the taxi to the top. I can recommend this trip for 3 reasons. 1, it teaches you about history, how people 100 years ago traveled from Japan to Europe, or from Europe to Japan. Second, it will teach you how big the continent is. If you use an airplane, you go very fast over it. But if you spend in a train 8 days until Moscow, and more further to the west, you start to understand how big the place actually is. And third, you'll meet lots of Russians who are talkative people, and perhaps can hear nice stories from them. And fourth, you can see nice scenery. I've done the trip 3 times and want to go back. There's an expression used in Japan. That's one year. Japan left Asia and entered Europe. This has actually never happened. But there's a country where this kind of movement has actually taken place. Russia is a country that has actually moved from Asia to Europe. And this was done by language, and not by moving Russia to any other place. You can do big things with language. And that's why language is so nice to do research on. This is because around the 15th and 16th centuries, the boundary between Europe and Asia used to run here. And Russia was an Asian nation. And the Russians moved the boundary by speaking, by writing, to the Urals, which did 2 things at the same time. First, Russia proper was moved to Europe, and simultaneously Russia got Siberia as an Asian colony, because the British and the French and the Dutch had colonies in Asia. And to be a big power, you had to have colonies. It was prestige. So they divided their own land into 2, a Russian, European part and an Asian part. And 2 important things were achieved at the same time. Move from Asia to Europe, which was important for the Russians. And second, rise of prestige, because Russia became a colonial power. So language is important. And big, important things can be done with language. If you know the game and succeed in playing the game very well. And in this, they succeeded. And we will come back to this next week to see more carefully how did the Russians do this. More nice theory, as we all like theory a lot. This is about essentialism and nominalism. This is a kind of reinterpretation of Ludwig Wittgenstein's idea that the meaning of words is in their use and not in the definitions existing in books. Essentialism would mean that something is called something because of its inherent essence. Its properties make it something. What could I use as an example? Well, let's stay in this Europe, Asia. essentialism would claim that Europe is called Europe because Europeans who have this kind of culture, this kind of economy, this kind of politics, this kind of organization live there. So that Europe, the name of Europe is derived from the essence of being European. And similarly, the idea goes that the name of Asia is derived from the fact that Asians live in Asia. They are like this and that, and have this kind of culture, this kind of economy, this kind of politics, this kind of social structure, and so on. This, of course, is not true. There's no way to get names from the essences. Names are given by people. There always is one person who names something. For instance, I'm one person. I could call this not a computer. I could call this a giraffe. I could call this America. Whatever. Because this is the way nominalism works. It always looks at words as givens, which is important. Children do this kind of naming all the time. They call this and that with various names, playing with words. Adults do it less, but basically we all can do it as much as we want. The basic problem is that if I want to call this a giraffe and want to get all people in the world to call their computers giraffes, it might be impossible. There's lots of competition always in language. All people, to a small extent or large extent, try to create new language. And only seldom does one person succeed in getting his or her new name intersubjective, which is a concept that means that more than one individual, from two persons to the whole humankind, use the same word in the same way. I can have my own private language game, and we all can have that. But to get our game, our pattern of naming, accepted in the wide society, it is difficult. And only few people ever succeed on that. Well, Wittgenstein created the name, concept of Sprachspiel. Now I'm using it in Japan. So he was very successful. Sometimes some people are successful. Nevertheless, what happens when a word becomes used widely by many people is that the names tend to become essentialized. When you use a word a lot, it comes in news media, it comes in entertainment, it's simply around us all the time. We tend to forget that somebody somewhere has given them and simply start to accept them as normal language, stop thinking about it. And then we can start to feel that they are essentialized concepts. And so we get into these kind of ideas that Europe is Europe because there are Europeans and it's everything there is European. And Asia is Asia because everything there is Asia. and this is the normal, everyday kind of understanding of these names. And what researcher has to do is to see through these everyday understandings. And even if you are doing empirical studies, how many of you are sociologists? Is anybody a sociologist? Uh-huh. We are in the Department of Sociology, but no sociology students can come here. Okay, whatever you are. It is always good to go to see the history of your concepts. It will illuminate to you the fact that the concept has not been the same always. Help you do good, high-class research. Go over these essentialized meanings. More about this. Names that are in active use are always contested. When you do research on concepts, you see that there's always some kind of disagreement about them. If nobody uses them, then there is no disagreement, but there is, if somebody uses them, there's always some kind of quarrel going on. And it is not a bad thing. It simply is the way it is. And when you try to define some kind of concept for your own research, you always face this kind of dilemma. That scholar says so, that scholar says so, and this one says that. And where do you choose and how do you do? You can feel a certain level of mental anguish, but you don't need to, because the situation makes you free. It liberates you to create your own definitions and concepts. And perhaps you can get them also propagated to an intersubjective level. Make yourself famous by giving a birth to a new type of understanding a certain kind of concept. Rhetorical redescription means exactly this process. That you take something existing and you turn it into something else. And you can do this unconsciously or consciously. But people who are good in this are skillful in playing these language games. And it is good, perhaps sometimes, to give it a try. And rhetorical redescriptions are what we also deal in this lecture series. We look in practice how the concept of Asia has been turning and moving and changing in its history. We'll deal with various languages: English, German, Latin, some Greek, at least. And some Chinese also. I'm very bad with the language, and some Japanese also. There's lots of languages in the Eurasian continent. I can't know most of them, but now you know a few. And we'll also move within the various different disciplines. Some geography, some cultural studies, some political science, some economics, some history of cartography, and so on. And see how people define and play these language games in different contexts. Oh yes, religion will also be very important in the history of these days. Again, an example of specific language game that is taking place. Here we have Helada, Greece, drawn in yellow, and this is a very political language game. And then here we have parts of Turkey, drawn in red. The Greeks started the systematic geographic use of these concepts of Asia and Europe, as we will see during the next hour. And the original idea is that the boundary is here on the Aegean Sea, so that the western parts of the Aegean Sea was Europe, and the eastern part used to be Asia. But this was not about the Greeks and the Persians. This was about the Greeks themselves, because Greeks were living all over these islands. It's only about this landmass here and then landmass there. So all this used to be Asia in the past. And if you go and look at maps drawn about Asia Minor, or the Turkish Empire, or the Eastern Mediterranean, in the 19th century, all these islands are drawn as part of Asia. I have been giving lectures in Greece, and nowadays you definitely do not call these islands as Asia. It's absolute taboo. Don't say so. So that the boundary between Europe and Asia nowadays goes along the Turkish coasts, so that all islands drawn in yellow have to be part of Europe. Because there's a political boundary dispute going on between Greece and Turkey. So politically, you have to interpret. And the Greeks are ready to throw away some 3,000 years of history to interpret the situation nowadays differently from what they did in the past. They are the originators of this concept in this area. But no, they get angry and shocked if you mention that any part of Greece would be in Asia. All Greece absolutely has to be Europe. And this is a language game that the Greeks have been able quite well to get through, at least in the European Union. Names appear as synecdoches, and synecdoche is a specific concept of rhetorical theory. Synecdoche means a short symbol, like a name. It is a short, small symbol. And these symbols represent larger narratives. The intersubjective establishment of a name, a concept, has to be done in living language. And the telling of stories about the object or the naming is the best way to get these accepted by a wider amount of people. Because if you can create an interesting story with drama and perhaps some humor or whatever, This story goes inside our people, because people, we are social beings who like to be entertained by other people, by stories, and by stories being educated about the world. So names and narratives are connected. If you have a name without a narrative, nobody uses it. And one of the research materials that I have used in my studies of the history of the concept of Europe has been narratives, but what people tell about their own area or the other area. So we have a small name and a big narrative, and the narrative in this way, or the name in this way, functions as a container which can be filled with many kinds of meanings. This slide about George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, they are American researchers of cognitive psychology, and they published 3 decades ago a very nice book, Metaphors We Live By, which I can also recommend to you. It is again belongs to the same family of books as Wittgenstein's Philosophische Untersuchungen, but this is much more easier to understand. Wittgenstein is a nice author but a philosopher, and these are not philosophers, they are psychologists who write quite clearly. The idea here is that once upon a time, at least especially in the conceptualization that we are talking about here, we have one kind of meaning which gets old and sinks to the bottom, and a new one, the yellow one, comes. 1,000 years passes and the yellow one is becoming old, and something new, like the red one, comes along. And another 1,000 years passes and the red one sinks to the bottom, and again something else comes up. If you look for short periods, a year, 10 years, you can see only very, very small changes in concepts. But if you go to look for 1,000 years or longer, you can see actually how great the changes can be. And that is why I will start these lectures on ancient Greece and then end in the present day. Because this long history shows so clearly all these changes. Well, we'll go more to this in the next lecture, but again an example of the ways Europe and Asia can be defined. Seneca, a Roman scholar, brilliant person, placed once upon a time the boundary on Donau. What is Donau in English? I don't actually know.
Danube.
Danube, yes, that's it. And the Rhine. This used to be political. And from there, again, back to the east. The Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs published in 1991, right after the end of the Cold War, a nice map of Asia and Oceania, Asia Yomitai Yoshu. They no more have this map. They have only written explanations, but this moment, right after the Cold War, used to be a kind of, well, liberating opening period, and they placed things into a map, where we have this modern understanding of Asia. This we have already talked about, where we have Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, China, Mongolia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. Also Papua New Guinea here. But here we also have Australia and New Zealand, which used to be very strongly associated with Europe in the past. And from about this time onwards, early 1990s, the Australians have started quite strongly arguing that they have to be counted as part of Asia nowadays, and no more as part of Europe. I've even been listening to Foreign Minister Gareth Evans once, where he explained this idea. I think it was 1993 in Hong Kong. This is a language game that has not yet completely succeeded. Australia has been able to get into an amount of Asian international organizations already. But then there used to be also always voices that Australians are not real Asians. This kind of essentialist argument, and they should be kicked out. We have been pushing now this for 2 decades, and this is one instance, and I think they are succeeding because they simply push, and Japanese are helping them. The Japanese government at least, and whether it is what kind of parties are in the government, they all seem to agree on this. They're quite willing to welcome the Australians, and New Zealanders also as part of these Asian communities. So this is one specific language game, one specific act of naming that is becoming intersubjective within a lifetime, and which can be seen. And it has been quite interesting to follow this for these 2 decades that have been going on. And this is also something that we will come closer at the end of these lectures. And this is also about the future lectures. The name of the language game here in the East has been so that the image, the meaning of Asia, which used to be quite bad even after the Second World War, about poor countries, poor places, undeveloped region, it has been turned into a very good, nice, beautiful narrative of first rapid economic development, and then about affluence, of being rich, of having lots of advanced technology, of having big economy. But this process, this game, is controlled by states that already are powerful and rich. Nowadays, the rules go so that countries that are geographically in East Asia and which are rich, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan is an anomaly, but there are reasons for that. And nowadays China also, more and more. They certainly belong to all important Asian organizations. Then we have this miracle Asia, where rapid economic growth is taking place, where China still is. Many countries in Southeast Asia also. India is there. In the 1980s, when Indian economic growth was very low, it was not discussed here in the East as an Asian country. After Indian growth picked up, not 10% a year, but fairly good, between 6 and 8% a year, it became invited as part of Asia. And Asia is nowadays an expanding concept, because there are countries that want to join Asia. Australia and New Zealand are examples. And Europe is a contracting concept, because at least these countries wanted to leave Europe. Well, European Union has been expanding also. There are things taking place within the vicinity of Europe. But European expansion does no more take place in the global sense. But as you know, the United States is an Asian country nowadays, at least at small levels. The United States participates in East Asian summits. And at the level of naming, and even intersubjective naming, this makes the United States now part of Asia. Russia just organized about a month ago in Vladivostok a big meeting of APEC meeting, and they had poured billions of rubles for building bridges and making Vladivostok beautiful, just for this meeting. The idea being that they have to be accepted as an Asian state. So there are lots of countries now vying for becoming part of Asia. So they are being named as Asia. It is a process where this naming, this contestation, this debate and quarrel is at its hottest. Places like Russia and then USA, perhaps Canada also. They might be interested in places like Chile or Peru or Mexico a bit later. We'll see, but I would not be surprised at all. And then we have here a place we have written potentially Asia. It is basically the rest of the world, which for one reason or other, perhaps sometimes can want to become part of Asia. And I would not be surprised if, say, 100 years from now, Western Europeans would like to be named as Asians and join Asian organizations. It depends how the economy and politics in Europe goes. Not within the next years. Not within the next decades even, I think. But 100 years is a long time. But of course it is easy for me to predict 100 years from now I will be dead and not responsible for what I am saying here. The Eurasian continent at this moment is in a strange and interesting situation in terms of names. Because normally when you name geographic places, you have 4 directions. There's the center, and there's north, south, east, and west. You have northern China, southern China, western China, eastern China, central China. The same in most places. The Japanese most used western and eastern because it's a long and narrow country, but anyway. This is the normal way of naming abstractly space. But what we have in the Eurasian continent is something different. We have concentrations of names in some parts and missing names in other parts. We have Northern Europe, and JyvÄskylÄ is here, as I showed you before. We have Southern Europe, we have Western Europe, we have Central Europe. But we no more have Eastern Europe. 30 years ago we had Eastern Europe. Now it is a taboo. Or if you use the word, some people may become angry. So you don't use it. It is a taboo now. The East is strangely open. Then we have Northeast Asia, Japan, the Koreas and China. We have Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries. We also have East Asia, which may mean, the old meaning is China, Korea and Japan. But in the 1980s, the Japanese adopted Southeast Asians as part of East Asia. Abe Shintaro used to be a Japanese foreign minister who announced loudly and publicly, Southeast Asians are East Asians. And he won this game, and now they are all from countries into East Asia. We have South Asia, the Indian subcontinent. What is missing here is North Asia. China is sometimes called North Asia. But when you think of this, there's no name for it except Siberia or Russia. And what is also missing is West Asia. You very seldom see this word. What used to be called West Asia is nowadays called Middle East. And you have, but Central Asia you have. One would suppose that these Russian places here would be North Asia, because they are north from the center. And here we would have West Asia, because it would be west of the center, but no, this is not the case. Language is not used in this way. This is actually the fact why I originally began to look for the history of the concept of Asia, also Europe. Because why does this map look like this? If so important names are missing, we are in the presence of something important. And I think I will conclude my lecture series 4 weeks from now, in this kind of discussion, I simply will tell the end now that we are in an interesting period in the history of humankind. Names that have been used by our forefathers and mothers for 2,000 years, more in cases. This is now breaking down. And quite new geographical regions are being born at this moment. The meaning of Europe is concentrating on the European Union. The meaning of Asia is concentrating on this area from Pakistan or India to Japan, and from China, Mongolia to Australia and New Zealand. Russia is so big. Well, it's not so many people, about more than 100 million only, but it's big. And it has lots of influence, especially in its neighboring areas. So the areas of former Soviet Union, except perhaps Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, some other countries here, they tend nowadays to form their own geographic region. This is the reason why we don't have the concept of North Asia, because it has been overlaid by Russian presence. And we have here a geographic, religious and cultural area which is to a certain extent in conflict with everybody else. That is Islam. They have conflicts with the West, the Christians, conflict with the Russians, the Orthodox, the conflicts with the Hindus in India, conflicts with Buddhists. And they are being separated as a kind of continent of them all at this moment. Then we have Black Africa. So the old division between Eurasia is being broken down, at least in our lifetime, in these kind of new areas. The second thing that follows from this is that Asia and Europe no more touch each other. They used to be always together, because there were only 2 continents on this landmass. But now they no more touch directly. And if a person like me likes conceptual studies, on this is very interesting. I don't know about you, but this is what I am talking about.